This is Peter,
And this is Tom.
and you're listening to History Teachers Talking Podcasts. All right, this is Peter Zablocki and Thomas Reska, and welcome back to our podcast. Tommy, what do we got?
Well, today we're going to look at something that you even said, I don't know how this doesn't get as much attention as it does. And with all the, I don't want to say nuclear tension, but with some of the tensions or some of the what you're hearing about what's going on in Ukraine and that people are worried about what Putin might do, we're going to talk about a time in history where the world almost could have gone to nuclear war, but didn't. And most people didn't even know how close we were. And we're going to talk about the Able Archer 83 exercise, which took place in November of 1983. It was basically a war exercise that almost led the Soviet Union to think it was a real nuclear attack getting planned by NATO, and they were preparing to pre-strike our first strike, basically.
Yeah, like very close.
Very close. No, bombers were ready to go. Like that's it.
No, they already had bombs loaded on planes.
Yeah,
like,
loaded on the planes. They were ready to go. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'm reading a book about it right now. It's shocking. First of all, I think a lot of this more is going to come out considering the fact that, the most of the files about this were only declassified in 2015, with the remainder of the classifications coming out in 2021. So this is still, even though this happened so long ago, they just formally declassified the rest of the documents. Really in the past 6 years, did we come to find out how close the world got to complete nuclear Armageddon. And we always, when we teach this, you and I, we always get into Cuban Missile Crisis and what a big deal Cuban Missile Crisis was, which it was. We're not going to deny that. But this was 1980s nuclear technology versus early 60s technology as a different animal altogether. And this really, as we will mention in a little bit, the context to this, the history surrounding it, and really the feelings that Soviet Union had towards the United States at the time and the United States towards Soviet Union, really this atmosphere made it almost blow up. I mean, we would not be here right now.
It was probably like the closest since the Cuban Missile Crisis. That's what a lot of people argue. There are some historians that can say, it wasn't that as big as people thought. There were going to be safe places, safeguards put in place. There was a hotline and stuff like that was put in place after the Cuban Missile Crisis. But it wasn't just Able Archer 83 itself that led to this near nuclear war, nuclear accident. There was a lot of other factors kind of like that led to it. I think that's where we should start. So a lot of that starts, a lot of the articles I always said is they start almost like 2 years earlier in May of 81, dealing with something known as Operation Ryan. I'm sure you saw this a little bit, right? And it was basically more or less that the Soviet Union, a lot of these general secretaries in the Soviet Union, KGB chairmen, they believed from their espionage that the United States was preparing a secret nuclear attack on the U.S.S.R. A lot of this paranoia. So they were already going into this with this mindset, and a lot of this all was brought about because of Ronald Reagan. Reagan is elected president, and they're just worried about Reagan. That they're basically saying, listen, Reagan is unpredictable, and that he could push the nuclear button at any moment. And that's really how they saw Reagan and the Soviets. And again, a lot of this is declassified. We didn't know this going into this, but the Soviet Union was afraid of the United States, just as there were Americans afraid of the Soviet Union at the time too. Like, when are they just going to push the button and just like go for it? Even though it's not that simple, it's not just a push button and everything's over. But you had a lot of these intelligence officers that are saying, "Listen, it's going to happen." And a big thing with this is because I was reading a couple of articles about this. Is they all talked about it. Is that the Soviet leadership was still reeling from World War II when they didn't suspect the Nazi invasion.
Yeah,
like the Nazi turned them out of nowhere. So they were still like saying they had this paranoia even about that at any moment, their enemy is just going to attack and we have to be ready. We have to strike first. That's really what was going on at this time.
Also, one thing you bring up about, we're talking about Brezhnev and Andropov, who eventually takes over for Brezhnev when he dies. The guys that are in charge in the Soviet Union are old World War II vets. Like, these people fought in World War II. Yeah. They were, well, not directly, they were already in higher positions under Stalin, but that's why there's that old mentality, because they were around when Soviet Union was attacked in 41. So that's why there's this mentality that comes from it, because these guys are so old. And, Brezhnev obviously was so old and not well that he winds up dying in the early 80s. And then Andropov that takes over, he also, Yuri Andropov basically takes over and he's already sick, right? So he doesn't last long either. But this Operation Ryan you talk about is exactly a direct response to Ronald Reagan rhetoric. And the rhetoric, I mean, is when Ronald Reagan becomes president, he actually continues something a lot of people don't realize, that Jimmy Carter's the one that really starts American military buildup in late 70s. And this stems from the invasion, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And you have Jimmy Carter gets really upset. He obviously would boycott the Olympics. And then at the same time, he starts to spend a lot more money on the American military. However, that is nothing in comparison to what Ronald Reagan does. As you mentioned, Tom, like Ronald Reagan comes in with a very aggressive foreign policy. You wind up cutting a lot of social programs to upkeep this military buildup of the United States. And through this military buildup in the United States, he also speaks out against Soviet Union. And one particular speech to some Christian organization, he winds up calling the Soviet Union an evil empire.
The evil empire,
And
exactly.
right, and even like Nancy Reagan was like, maybe you shouldn't say that. And he's like, no, I feel like I need to say this. And he calls them out as the evil. And he goes, if anybody ever has any doubt, this is the good fighting evil, and they are evil. And this kind of rhetoric really freaks out Brezhnev, who is current general secretary, or the
Yeah.
dictator of Soviet Union,
Well,
and his
yeah,
KGB chairman Andropov,
absolutely. It's going to
and
freak you out. The other side's calling you evil, that you're the bad guy, we're the good
and
guy.
building up
We're going to be
military.
the just war. Like they're used to hearing this. Last time they heard stuff like this was what was going on with the Nazis. Like
Yes,
what happened then they get invaded. And during this time too, as all this is going on, the United States are flying.
this was crazy,
We
right?
Yeah, we're flying fighter jets and we're flying bombers right up to Soviet airspace, setting off all their alarms and turning away at the last possible second. And we did this multiple times, like a week. And we would also we sent over 40 of our new like stealth, not planes, but
Battleships.
stealth, battleships. Yeah, like
Well,
submarine.
battleship, airplanes,
Yeah, right off their
submarines.
coast. We were just seeing how close we could get, and we basically showed. And then we would like just surface, like, "Oh, hi, we're here," and it was like right off the coast of like the
Alaska,
Kola
right?
Peninsula, yeah,
Yeah.
right the Crimean Peninsula. And then the Soviets like, what is going on? Like, why are they getting so close? And we don't know they're getting so close. So they're seeing kind of this gap in technology. Also, they're like, how does NATO have this technology? We don't. We can't find these ships. These ships are getting super close to us. These planes are flying right at us, setting off all the alarms. And it was basically seeing, what they could do. And they were doing this all the way also in Fleet X 83. I'm sure you saw this,
Yep.
what was going on, where we had a bunch of F-14 Tomcats, right, from Top Gun that basically flew over Soviet military bases. And then they just, simulating a bombing run. And the Soviets, like, you can't do that. And it also showed the Soviets that, like, they basically had no defense for this.
And the reason we're doing this really is because we're trying to, we're not just doing this to piss off the Soviets. We're doing
No.
this because we actually want to get a reaction from the Soviets, because we want to see their reaction capabilities. This is all this was
Yeah,
about.
that stuff. Exactly.
Exactly. Like we wanted to
If we
see,
had
all
to,
right,
what would we do?
if this is happening, if we're attacking, how quickly will they respond? And when they do respond, what would be the first thing that they would be going for? What would be the first movements they would do? This was really just us compiling a dossier or some form of a file, really,
Yeah.
on what
What,
what
what,
what would be the response of the Soviet Union to any
right,
attack.
you're poking the
I know,
bear.
absolutely.
Like, do you really want to say, oh, what would they do if we, what if they decide to, I don't know. And looking back at it, it's like, they might just decide, forget it. This is a nuclear attack, which is what
Yeah.
almost happened. So that's what's going through the Soviets' mind during this time. And it says, I know, you're playing with
Well,
fire a
that
little
going
bit.
back to the Ryan thing, like you mentioned, Operation Ryan is basically the Soviet Union is saying, all right, we need to listen in on all possible radio between the allies, right? Not the allies anymore, but NATO powers. Like we are going to try to find out what they're up to, what they're talking about. And, the Soviet Union really kind of creates this is the actual headquarters. I think it's in East Germany, or maybe even in East Berlin in West Germany. But the idea here is to try to get as much intel as possible as to like what are the Americans and the British doing. Like we need to figure this out because something's not right. Something's not going right. And I think that this idea of the Fleet X-83, where we're flying really, really close and then flying away to see how they react, and I think that directly leads to the Korean Airlines flight, right?
Yeah, the
Of
Korean Airlines flight
Yeah, go ahead.
007, which again could be a podcast or stuff. I'm sure there's podcasts
Yeah.
out there about it. On September 1st, 1983, the Korean Airlines flight 007 was shot down by a Soviet interceptor. It flew over the Sea of Japan, which was flying over the Morin Island, and it was flying over prohibited Soviet airspace. and
Yep.
they shot it down, and it killed
Yep.
all 269 passengers on board. One of which was a sitting member of the House of Representatives from Georgia,
Yep.
Larry McDonald. He was killed, and he happened to also be the president of the an anti-communist society. So there was
Yep.
kind of conspiracy theory, that why they shoot this one down. He knew that guy was on it. So that's a whole big thing. They thought it was a bomber, so they shot.
That's what it
The
was. Yeah.
Soviets. That's the Soviets
Yeah.
line
Yeah,
anyway.
they're so paranoid at that point because of United
Yeah.
States exercises and the rhetoric coming from Reagan camp that they see something flying that size that could be a bomber, flying towards into their airspace, so they shot it down.
Yeah.
Like they're for all they
Well, they said
know.
they would shoot anything down over that airspace.
Yep.
But apparently, other flights did fly through there. Other time, it was one of those like, yeah, it was prohibited airspace, but there were flights that flew through it or very close to it. And there's some debate: did it really fly in, or how long was it in this prohibited airspace? But yeah, again, that just shows their paranoia. They were just so worried about that. They didn't want that first strike to happen to them. That's what they were, and they were so convinced that the Americans would attack first.
Yep. What essentially happens around this time, and what really adds to that fear that Americans might attack first, and that Americans are escalating the nuclear war as opposed to de-escalating it. So Yuri Andropov becomes the general secretary or the dictator after the death of Brezhnev in November of 1982, and he starts criticizing Reagan specifically for one thing, and that is Ronald Reagan in '83, early '83, winds up announcing this really ambitious and quite controversial strategy called the Strategic Defense Initiative, also
Star
commonly known
Wars.
as Star Wars.
Yes,
Yep.
Star Wars. There you go.
I mean, think about it though. Ironically, in 1983, at that time, Return of the Jedi was in a movie, so
Well, apparently that's what it was. Reagan
like
watched Return of
inspired
the
him.
Jedi, and it inspired him. That's come out. He was watching Return of the Jedi. He was like, I want that. Like, we need those things. And they're like, sir, it's a movie. He's like, how do you know it's a movie?
Search movies.
He's like, I want it. So
That's
we're going to
nuts.
do that. And the Soviets never knew that. Like, people said, this technology is not available.
Well, you want to
You could,
describe what the technology is?
well,
Let's
technology was basically satellites in outer space that had missiles on them that was going to shoot down other missiles and make like a shield. I remember Googling the videos. They actually went on TV and like explained it to like the American
like
people,
cartoons of it.
like
Yeah.
cartoons, what it was going to be. It looked like a video game. And they were showing them what it was. And people are saying, listen, this technology is decades away from what we can possibly do. And Reagan's like, no, build it.
Yep.
So do
I
it.
mean, it had
And
lasers on it,
yeah,
laser
lasers
guided.
to shoot
Like,
down. It
yeah.
was basically going to be any missiles that tried to hit us, the United States, was going to be shot down. What Reagan was doing, what made the Soviets so scared, is that he was taking a nuclear war, which was always decided like mad, right? Nuclear assured destruction, no one can win it, to now trying to actually win a nuclear war. That's
And
what
by
they
taking
say.
it into space, that was the
Like
key.
taking it into
He's
space, like how?
taking it into
So,
space.
yeah, exactly. So he's gonna try to win a nuclear war now. So if he's trying to win a nuclear war, then he's not going to be afraid to start a nuclear war, and that's what the Soviets are doing. So even though Star Wars was never really going to happen, although there are conspiracy theories that say no, they did build it and it is there, all the other stuff, is that basically the Soviets think that we were building it, and so they're spending all this money trying to keep up with it and trying to match what they think we're building, and they're like, we don't know how to do it because no one knew how to do it at the time.
Yep.
But it's just one of those things. So this is us adding to that paranoia, and then what led to the '83 nuclear incident, right, with Stanislav Petrov. Right, you saw
Yep.
this one. This
Yep.
was
Yep.
the one
Yep.
that I remember hearing about. They've recently, he actually got he passed away pretty recently, this man. But they said he's basically saved the free world because they had a new early warning system that they were building,
The Soviets
and the
did.
Soviets,
Yep.
and it reported a single ballistic missile launch from a U.S. territory. And he actually had authorization that he could launch his nuclear missiles from where he was. That they
Yep.
were, Soviets were different. Like they could launch these smaller ones, but still devastating out the nuclear weapons at any time if they detected a launch into Soviet Union territory. And he's like, this has to be an error. He's only because he was like, it did malfunction before. And he basically said, why would just one missile come from the U.S.? There had to be thousands, not one.
Yeah, but
It
then
doesn't make
more
any
came,
sense.
right?
Well, then 4 more did come. So
Yep.
people were saying, you have to launch. And he's like, no, it still doesn't make sense. And later he just said he just couldn't bring himself to do it. Like if he was
Yep.
wrong, then he was wrong, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. And it was later revealed that the system did malfunction because of how the sunlight bounced
It
off
was like weather.
some clouds and the clouds and stuff like that, some other satellites. But all of this is happening within just a few months of each other, right? And then Able Archer comes, and then the Soviets are like, "That's it. This has to be it." So they're
Also,
on high alert.
yeah, yeah, and one last thing before the Able Archer comes into play, this actual military exercise. There's one other thing that really freaks them out, the Soviets out, is the U.S. Pershing 2 missiles. Basically, this brand new missile that could be moved on trucks. So that's the beauty of it. It could be deployed from anywhere. It's intermediate range Pershing 2 missile. It was hard to detect because you could move it all the time, so you didn't really know where they were. They were small enough to be moved and hidden. And essentially, what it could do is they were capable of destroying any Soviet hard targets, including underground missile silos. And they could enter, if they had them anywhere, which they did, the United States did have them in Western Europe, they could enter Soviet airspace and actually hit targets in Soviet Union as far in as Moscow within 4 to 6 minutes. So that's also the fear here. Like, okay, if anything's coming, there's only 4 to 6 minutes. Basically, the Soviets want the U.S. to remove these Pershing missiles from this new technology, which was actually the Pershing missiles were so ahead of their time. I mean, they were like not laser guided, but they were like GPS guided. They could correct themselves if there was something in
Yeah, they
front
could
of it.
actually move. Yeah, they would.
Yeah,
Yeah,
they could like move around it. I mean, it was way
they
ahead
were
of its
accurate.
time.
It was an accurate nuclear weapon too.
Yeah,
Like that's what it was. So that
and
freaked them out absolutely.
that freaked him out more. So let's get into this exercise, Able Archer 83, and kind of talk about a scenario and like what actually happened here. So you want to take it?
Yeah, so it's basically again NATO, right, the North Atlantic
Yep.
Treaty Organization, which you've been hearing a lot about in the news. They've always done this, right? They've done these Able Archer activities. Happened to be the one in '83, where it's a hypothetical lead up to a war
Nuclear
with the
warfare.
Soviet Union, nuclear
Yep.
warfare. What was a little bit different about this one is you had the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff in D.C. and the British Ministry of Defense in London, and it was a war game, right, with intended to be
Hmm.
the blue forces of NATO going against the orange forces of the Warsaw Pact. And it involved a lot of proxy conflicts, like things going on in Syria, Yemen, Iran, escalating. And so they created a whole scenario to basically explain what was going on.
The scenario called for the orange forces or hypothetical opponent, right?
Yeah,
Supposedly, it essentially invades Yugoslavia. I think that was the
yeah,
first start of it. So that's the
yeah,
thing. It's like then the orange force, aka Soviet Union, on November 4th, it invades Yugoslavia. Then on the 6th, it launches chemical weapons. By the end of the day, they start using chemical weapons against other Western powers, and all these things are kind of taking place supposedly before the U.S. strike is commencing.
yeah. It's supposed to examine the transitioning from conventional to nuclear weapons.
Yep.
Like that's what it's supposed to see. And because of the other side consistently using, like you said, chemical weapons or
Yep.
whatever. And the whole time this is going on, the Soviets are listening to a lot of these transmissions, not all of it, but some of it. They're basically seeing this as like in part of a nuclear attack.
They are. Yep.
NATO was simulating a nuclear attack.
There was also something like Grenada. I remember there was like an issue with Grenada when we took over Grenada, and because of that, the United States was speaking a lot back and forth. There's a lot of jitter, radio jitter between U.S. and United Kingdom, and they basically misinterpreted that United Kingdom and the United States are planning something. It was a U.S.-led invasion in October of '83, so we haven't invaded it yet. But because we're discussing this invasion that has nothing to do with any of this right now, the Soviets misinterpret that. They're like, okay, they're going. There's a lot of radio silence between them, but they're also going back and forth. Like they're definitely planning something. Something's really happening here, but it
And
had
yeah,
no
and we
connection to it.
even went to DEFCON 1, readiness to
Well, that's the thing.
DEFCON
We
1.
went all the way down to DEFCON 1. Just so you guys
DEFCON
know,
1.
DEFCON
So,
2
yeah,
is the closest we've gotten to
yeah.
nuclear warfare because it goes
That was
counts
Cuban Missile Crisis, yeah.
Cuban Missile Crisis. Yep. Yeah, this went all the way to DEFCON, but also this included real politicians and like that were
Exactly. Their names and stuff that they were
exactly.
acting it out. They were acting out this war game. They were moving, and they were moving some military personnel and stuff like that. So all this was going on, and the Soviets are seeing all this, and they're freaking out. This is an escalation. The problem was it was not real. At least
Yep.
not in the West. Was like, we weren't actually doing this. This was just a war game. But they never told the Soviets, and the Soviets were so paranoid for everything else that was going on. They're like, this is it. This is that moment. This is what the 99 red balloons. This is it. It's happening.
Yep. I mean, at one point, even like British Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, like she took like part in this in the
Yeah.
exercise. She participated, like pretending like things are happening. Luckily enough, though, like Reagan was supposed to do it as well as Bush, H.W. Bush, and then last moment they're like, yeah, Robert McFarlane, who was the national security advisor, when he got closer, he goes, maybe you guys shouldn't participate. This might make it
You have
too
other
legit, but
you have
it
other
was
things to
already
do.
too
Yeah,
legit.
because I'm sure if Reagan did it, they probably would have went because they already believed
Yeah.
that about Reagan. So if then he would have started to partake in it, it would have just led to it. I don't know, probably. Luckily, it didn't happen. But like the Soviets are responding. This is not just a 1 day thing. This is lasting for over 5 days. this scenario will eventually culminate with NATO resorting to the use of nuclear weapons. And then the Soviets are watching this, being like, "What's going on?" So they're mobilizing their forces in response, and that's what
Yeah.
they're doing. And like you said before, they're going on, they're putting all their forces on high alert. They are getting
Oh,
bombers
yeah,
on
yeah.
the nuclear weapons are
Yeah.
being loaded onto bombers in Poland. Like they are ready for this reaction. They believe that this has happened. That's it.
The CIA winds up reporting later on, like again, this doesn't get really come out until 2015, but that you had the military district in Czechoslovakia, but as well Poland and East Germany, basically placed on high alert. Right, you have ready nuclear strike forces. The memorandum went as close to saying that the Fourth Air Army of the Soviet Union bombers of the Soviet forces in Germany, right, are literally placed on 30-minute alert with loaded and ready to be dropped nuclear weapons. At the same time, they also had the ICBMs, nuclear ICBM silos, were also readied. And those are very difficult for the US to detect. Like those things are underground throughout Soviet Union, so we wouldn't even find them. They were like a button away. But the thing is that then we start actually, so now CIA and the United States starts picking this up. We start actually picking up our own intel that like, wait, hold on, like Soviets are hardcore arming and ready to go here. And then at that point, thank goodness, the assistant chief of the U.S. Air Force in Europe, Leonard Perutz, I think, he basically is credited with a decision not to place NATO forces on increased alert, even though Soviet readiness got so close. The idea is like, wait, should we respond to it? So Perutz informs his superior, who's General Billy M. Minter, of this unusual activity that's happening in the Eastern Bloc, saying like, we're about to actually get attacked by the Soviets. However, Perut suggests that, you know what, why don't we just wait until the end of this exercise? It's almost over. We have like a day left, and maybe this behavior is caused by the exercise. Maybe the Soviets are actually, not silly is a terrible word, but paranoid enough to think this is real. So he actually purposely convinces the generals to not build up the actual nuclear strike.
So
Yep.
in the actual war game, right, Peru
Yep.
actually advised against responding to the Warsaw Pact military activity. So he just said,
Yep.
we're not going to do it. And then that ended the exercise on November 11th, 1983. So once they end that, that's crazy. And it's really crazy. I'm just thinking this now. November 11th was also what?
Well, I don't know. What was November
It's
11th?
Armistice Day. That's Armistice Day from World War One.
Oh, November 11th at
Yeah, the
11.
Veterans Day Army. So the idea of that, the whole point was to, the war to end all wars, and now it's also the war that ended the war that almost did end everything, right? This like simulation. But there's a lot of we mentioned before, historians and others that say, listen, there was too many other things, contingency plans in to make sure this didn't happen. But then there's others who's right, like listen, there's a whole bunch of contingency plans for response to nuclear attack, but everything was going to happen so fast that you have to wonder, like, could reason really be applied in such a crisis? You have like 6 minutes to decide how to respond to a blip on the radar screen, and then go and unleash all your nuclear weapons. Like, how could you apply reason in time like that? So, like, you got 6 minutes to decide. Like, what are you going to do?
Yeah.
If you really truly believe that those weapons are coming, it's not like you can call and be like, "Hey, did you really send these or not?" Like, this is a lot going on, a lot of panic and a lot of paranoia, and apparently they did tell Reagan about this later on, like 2 years later. They kind of explained it to him how close it was, and apparently he found it very sobering because he was kind of like, "Well, why would they think we were actually going to attack them?" And they're like, "Well, sir, you've been like saying all this stuff. You call them the evil empire. Like,
Yeah.
obviously they're going to think that we're enemies."
Ronald Reagan was brought into a prior training a year before where they actually brought him into a situation room and they put him on the, first of all, they put him on
Yeah.
a special airplane that's supposed to stay in the air for like 70 something hours without refueling. It's like the United States got ready for a nuclear attack where in case anything happens, Ronald Reagan could be put on this command center that would basically like, fly around the United States that's being destroyed underneath by atomic weapons. And they kind of put him through that exercise. And on this plane that has this like base, of operations on it, they kind of showed him the scenario of, they showed him a map, like a basically like a computer map. And they're like, all right, it's starting. And then he just wound up seeing red dots and it would get bigger, all major cities, starting with Washington, D.C. And they're like, all right, what do we do next? Mr. President, what do we do next? And before, like, as he's making decisions, there's another red dot. And like all of the United States is like, it was almost like a game he couldn't win. So he was sitting there watching and they were trying to figure out if he could make these decisions. Meanwhile, you have literally in front of him this interactive map that's just turning red, 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 red. And And that was very sombering for him. That he was like, "Whoa, like this is like crazy," and that scared him a little bit. But that was even before this, so it almost makes me think like you would think he would calm down a little bit, but he didn't, obviously. But from this point forward, I think this really sobered him up a little bit. If you look at his foreign policy in his second term, because this is all happening during his first term, in his second term, he kind of takes his foot off the pedal a little bit. He's more like, like once Gorbachev becomes the Soviet general secretary, right? Um, Gorbachev obviously is much more open to the West. He knows that the Soviet Union's economy is completely in disarray. They're producing less than half of what they were producing Soviet Union in 1950s. For a society where like 2/3 were agricultural and more than half the people couldn't afford food, looking around, you realize that Soviet Union was imploding. Like it was falling apart. And Ronald Reagan kind of takes his foot off the gas here, or the pedal, and starts to really go to Mikhail Gorbachev and say, "All right, let's figure this out. Let's talk peace." But by then, America is really talking peace from a position of strength, which, as we
Strength. Yeah,
mentioned,
they had to Glasnost, all that stuff. They had to basically,
yeah,
they had to change. They couldn't compete, and part of it was because they were trying to not only the war in Afghanistan, which I know we've talked about before in the podcast, but also just trying to keep up with capitalism. You can say whatever
yeah.
you want about, but a communist society cannot keep up with a capitalist society. As far as like economically, it's just not. It just doesn't work.
This wasn't really declassified. So the National Security Archive, right, it had this declassified because of the Freedom of Information Act that was requested
Yeah,
in 2015. And it really wasn't until like U.S. Department didn't fully declassify this until February of 2021
yeah. That's
for
when
us
they
to really
figured
find
out
out.
that. That's when they actually acknowledged that nuclear warheads were loaded onto bombers.
Yeah,
That's how close they got. Like the Soviets really believed something was happening. You can say maybe they weren't going to launch, but they were getting prepared just in case. You don't put the bombers, on high alert with loaded nuclear warheads ready to go unless you believe something is happening. And there's been a lot of lessons learned from this. There's a lot of basically, like I said, the Americans and the Russians were like, all right, we have to have a bit more communications. We can't be calling each other evil. We can't look at each other that way because that's going to just rise the tension so much. Like you're just waiting for something to happen then. And you don't think the 80s is really a height of the Cold War, but it boiled up big time in the 80s, without a doubt,
yeah.
especially the early 80s.
Leonard Perutz, like, I mean, he's getting, I hope I'm saying his name right, right? Perutz, would you say?
Yeah, Perutz, yeah.
Perutz. The Air Force Assistant Chief of Staff for Intelligence. I mean, he really should get a lot of credit, just like as his Soviet counterpart a few years back for, it's almost like you have a right man at the right time in the right position making the right choice, where he could have easily said, all right, Russians are building up, we need to respond. Meanwhile, he goes, no, let's just stop the training and see what happens. Like, again, cooler heads will prevail.
Yeah, but he
Crazy.
kind of believes that maybe we are setting him off a little bit. If that's the case, that's not what this is about. Let's
Yeah.
not. He's decided let's not poke the bear anymore. Basically,
11,000 warheads, Soviet warheads, were put on maximum combat alert within 2 days.
it's just one of those exercises, like you said, that almost leads to World War III. And you talking about it now, like when Putin's talking about, if this keeps upwards with the United States, or any of the allies, what do you say? It's going to have consequence like you've never seen before. Right? So people are worried about what's going on there, although they're saying, like, listen, there's no way Putin's going to use nuclear weapons in Ukraine.
Yeah.
So it's just like rising. It's just like that rising tension there. Like the U.S. is selling military aid to Ukraine. They're not going to send troops on the ground there, but it's also just one of those things. Where could something be misinterpreted the wrong way? Like you don't want World War III to start no matter what, but you definitely don't want it to start off like a miscommunication.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's
Again, I
probably
think
why there
this is
are a
very
lot of open
sobering.
channels now. There are a lot of open channels now, even backdoor channels that we are not even aware of, where like individual generals and stuff are communicating with one another. I know that's something that happens a lot because they want to avoid. These are lessons that they've learned from this. That there has to be constant communication between nuclear powers whenever there's some sort of war. All the war games after this are kind of like announced. Like they know it's going to happen. Like a lot of times when we anger North Korea, when we're doing different war games and stuff like that, they know about it. Like we're going to be conducting maneuvers here, or vice versa, because they just want to make sure that nothing is interpreted the wrong way.
It's funny because, just as we're talking, I just Googled Putin nuclear weapon, right? And top stories: Poland suggests hosting U.S. nuclear weapons amid growing fears of Putin's use of nuclear weapons. If Putin, opinion, New York Times: if Putin uses nuclear weapons, how should a world respond? Ukraine leader says Putin wouldn't survive nuclear attack. If Putin goes nuclear, the U.S. should avoid joining the war, says the Washington Post. This is like a live thing,
Yeah,
Will
it's what
this
I
guy
think.
use?
It's a trend. People are really legitimately worried. And I guess whenever nuclear power gets into a conflict like this, and he does like to talk that way, like it's one thing when like Kim Jong Un and stuff talks that way. He does have some nuclear capabilities. It's like a little bit different than when like a true nuclear power is talking about him. So
Crazy.
Russia has more nuclear weapons they believe than the United States does at this
Yeah,
point.
we did a podcast on it, remember?
Because
Yeah.
they kept so many. They're not sure how many are actually operational. But again, how many do you need, right?
Oh, yeah.
You don't. Again, I think they're the ones that they're saying he might use on Ukraine. That they're arguing. I'm not saying he's going to use it. Are more tactical, which are smaller. But again, what's a small nuclear weapon?
Wow. It's interesting because Putin keeps on, even today, reminding the world that only the United States so far in the world has
them.
used nuclear weapons in battle, Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and he keeps on saying like you guys are judging me, but like look in a mirror. It's it's definitely something to think about. That's for sure. Well, hopefully we won't have to make a podcast about nuclear weapons being used anytime soon.
Well, no. Then we're not making any more podcasts.
Yeah, no, we're gonna do the whole John Connor thing, and then try to fight with the resistance. But anyway, I think that pretty much concludes our podcast on Able Archer 83. I think this was a fun one.
And
I think
look it up if you have more. If you're curious about it, there's a lot of stuff out there. A lot of stuff that's still coming out about it. So it's an interesting topic, and it's one of those. It just makes you think.
Absolutely.
It wasn't that long ago.
Yep. And hopefully, like I said, and like you said, this is something that hasn't been talked about, but it probably should be talked about a lot more.
Absolutely.
So with that in mind, thank you everyone so much for tuning in once more to our podcast. We really appreciate it. If you need to find us, you could find us at www.historyteacherstalkingpodcast.com. If you have any questions, comments, or reactions, please feel free to shoot us an email. So thank you so much, guys. Have an awesome week.
Stay safe, everybody.
I hope everyone enjoyed our podcast, and if you would like to email us, you can do so at historyteacherspodcast@gmail.com.